Something tragic happened to some cousins of mine in Wisconsin a few months ago. In the middle of the night, my cousin Tim and his wife Jelaine were awakened by a phone call that said, "Your daughter Caitlin was in an accident. Come quickly." When they drove out into the Wisconsin countryside to the scene of the accident, it was full of emergency vehicles. They learned that their 16-year-old Caitlin was among 9 teenagers, girls, crammed into a car. And when the driver went 100 miles an hour to jump over a hill in the countryside, she lost control and the car tumbled over and over. They didn't know where Caitlin was because there was no one there to identify the girls or to say to what hospitals they had been sent. 2 hours later, they found her. But on the way, Jelaine said to Tim, "Caitlin is dead." And when they got there, they found that that was true. Caitlin and 2 other girls had died. The 6 others, including the driver, had survived. I had the chance to speak with Tim and Jelaine when I was in Wisconsin last summer. They're still struggling with Caitlin's death, of course. In fact, today at 9:30 in Wisconsin, a Mass was offered for her. When I talked with them, they told me one of the hardest things in the world is for a parent to lose a child, especially someone like 16-year-old Caitlin, who was so popular with everybody, so loved by them all, so energetic and vivacious, athletic. This is their cross. And I admired with what courage and faith they were bearing it. Their story gives us an insight into today's gospel. The early church was something like my cousins, trying to face the question of why someone as good as Jesus suddenly suffered the terrible tragedy of crucifixion and death. Today's Gospel of Mark is something of an answer to that. The way that Mark puts it in today's Gospel, in the dialogue, it seems that Jesus knew all of this would happen and in fact predicted the resurrection. But that's Mark's perspective of the death of Jesus from the resurrection. The gospel was preached after the resurrection, and that changed the whole perspective of the cross. So the dialogue that Mark puts in his gospel today is not so much historical, but theological. That this was God's way of bringing life out of death. What had been a tragedy was turned into an incredible victory, an incredible triumph when Jesus came back from the dead, risen, the same one who had been crucified, now resplendent, triumphant, transformed with a new and a wondrous life. The same Jesus that had been crucified on Good Friday. The resurrection of Jesus opened up a whole new chapter in human history. And it told us the kind of God that God is. God is the kind of God that can turn tragedy into victory. God is the God of life that can overcome death. God is the one that can allow a human tragedy like the death of Jesus, or the death of Caitlin, or the death of so many people in our own lives, because death is not the last word. Death is the first word of a whole new vocabulary. Death is a door, not a wall. Death opens up for us, in a sense, the next stage of human evolution, the next stage of human transformation, immortality, life without death. That is what is promised in today's gospel. This is a mystery, of course. We call it the paschal mystery, the way that life comes through death, that death can be overcome, and that death is a friend, not an enemy. In fact, St. Francis of Assisi called death sister death, as if it were a member of the family. But that's not easy to feel and believe when death comes tragically, as it did to Jesus or to Caitlin or to the people we love in our own lives. We see and feel only the cross. I once heard a bishop describe a cross this way. He said a cross has two beams. The first points heavenward, and that is God's will. The other runs along the way of earth, and that is our will. When the two cross, you have a cross. Well, that's beautiful and simple, but I think there is another explanation that is more earthly. We can understand the beam that points toward heaven as representing all of those people who really try to be loving and peaceful and merciful and forgiving and gentle in their lives. And the beam that runs along earth are all those who are so selfish they think of no one but themselves. They're greedy, they hang on to wealth and power and prestige, and even will turn to rage and hostility and violence to preserve it. That's the kind of cross. When these two cross, there is a cross, especially for those who try to be people of peace and justice. That's the kind of cross that Jesus met. And that's the kind of cross that we find everywhere, from the streets of Syria and Libya to the streets of Los Angeles. Today's gospel is meant to be a message of hope that our God is a God of life, that life is stronger than death, that resurrection is much more powerful than crucifixion, and that God is here to help us carry our crosses. That's what we celebrate in every Eucharist. That is what we will celebrate in a moment. Not just the death of Jesus, but the resurrection as well. So may God's word and sacrament nourish each one of us and our crossed-up world to change our crosses into yokes.